I think of the words of Don Isaac, who says, "It is no great honor when a Jew is asked to plead for the safety of his people." And then I come back to Judah, and he's negotiating with the Pharaoh's representative, and he doesn't have anything to offer. He doesn't have food or wealth or riches. All he has is to offer himself up as a replacement for his brother Benjamin.
That's really fascinating. I wonder if one of the reasons the rabbis are going to read this as a confrontation rather than as a pleading is because of how uncomfortable the pleading version is. It's pretty uncomfortable. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to TEXTing IRL, Ideas for Real Life, where we wrestle with the big dilemmas of our time through the lens of classical and modern Torah texts. I'm your host, Elana Stein Hain. We're recording on December 3rd, 2025. It is Jew versus Jew. It's how so many of us feel. As a New Yorker, for example, I experienced that so deeply during the Mamdani election, and now during his transition to mayor. Which Jews endorsed him? Which Jews opposed him? Who's joining his transition team? Who isn't? And so much more. With the rise of polarization in America and in the West generally, Jews are increasingly pitting themselves against each other in the public square. How new is this? I'm not sure, but I do know that there are at least three factors that make the issue feel existential right now. First is simply the visibility. With the rise of social media, we are so hyper-aware of the different opinions and groups within the Jewish community. Second, I think, is the aftermath of October 7th. Often a moment of trauma is something we hope would bring us together. And maybe it did for a short time, but much of that has dissipated. And thirdly, the rise of antisemitism has made Jews acutely aware of the importance of addressing this issue as a community. But as we heard on the podcast with Stacey Burdett a few weeks ago, different Jewish groups even disagree about how to deal with that, with antisemitism. Which means that to talk about polarization in the Jewish community, you don't even need to reach the anti-Zionist end of the Jewish spectrum. Even among Zionists, disagreements are not simply personal, they're political. Jewish groups lobby for different things, different candidates, different policies, different visions. And even among those who are trying to fight anti-Semitism, the strategies and the messaging vary. Moreover, in these battles of Jew versus Jew, other people are watching. What I mean by this is, because this is playing out so publicly, there's always third parties trying to either make sense of the disparity and disagreements among Jews, or sometimes trying to weaponize the disagreements among Jews. Oh, well, how could it be that you think X if those Jews think not X, or good Jews think X and the problematic Jews think Y? So how are we supposed to think about what Jewish advocacy for our community means when there are multiple sub-communities with differing visions? How are we supposed to engage third parties from outside the Jewish community given this reality? Is there such a thing as mainstream Jewish politics anymore, given these fractures? And how do we just face each other, given those fractures? You know, there's a great opportunity to think about this through the lens of this week's Torah portion, Vayiggash. It begins with Yehuda seemingly begging Yosef not to take Benjamin as his indentured servant. But the Midrash reads this less as begging and more as a face-off, a confrontation in which Yehuda and Yosef trade barbs as the onlookers stand dumbfounded. What can we learn from this face-off about how Jews can and should relate to each other? What can it mean for the future of the Jewish people? What does it teach us about how we might approach Jewish advocacy today? To consider this question, I have invited Jeremy Burton, who has served as the executive director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Boston, the JCRC, for the past 15 years. Jeremy is no stranger to fractures within Jewish communal advocacy. He was the senior vice president of programs at the Jewish Funds for Justice, vice president of programs at the Jewish Funders Network, and he came to the Jewish community from a career in political strategy and public communications, having worked for New York Mayor David N. Dinkins, among others. And I am proud to call Jeremy a friend, too. And I have to thank Hartman for that. And while we're thanking people, thank you to our wonderful sponsors, Micah Philanthropies and the Walder Charitable Trust. Jeremy, hi, welcome.
I'm so excited to talk Torah and civics with you. Thank you for having me,
That is
Elana.
amazing. And I'm sorry, I have to do the shout out to your mom. It doesn't matter how old you are. Diane Sandoval, we love you. And we hope that you're watching.
We do.
So, Jeremy, let's jump right into it, okay? I want to remind listeners they can follow the texts in our show notes. So let's start with two moments, actually, where the brothers are standing face to face in this week's Parsha, and see how the rabbis actually pull these moments together. Let's start with the first one. It's the opening of the Parsha. Vayiggash elav Yehuda, and Judah went up to him, came close to him, Vayomer, and said, Bi Adoni, please my Lord, Yedaber na avdecha davar be'oznei Adoni. I'd like to say something before my Lord. Va'al yichar apcha be'avdecha, don't be mad at me. Ki chamocha kifaro, because you are equal to Pharaoh. Now, Yehuda at this point does not realize that he's talking to his brother. He only knows that he's facing someone whose interests differ from his own, and he worries about the power that this someone has over him, even as he would worry about Pharaoh. So when you see this, what jumps?
I love thinking about this text because it immediately takes me to this idea of Yehuda, Judah the Jew, literally standing in the court, pleading with an external power. He doesn't know that this is Joseph. He doesn't know that Joseph is his brother. He sees this as a representative of the Pharaoh, and he's acting in a way that is very much a part of a long tradition from him, almost up to the modern time, of the court Jew, of engaging with civic leaders from a place of powerlessness, pleading with them, flattering them. You're like Pharaoh. And I think about like Yochanan ben Zakkai going to Vespasian and basically give me Yavna as a very similar dynamic of the powerless Jew who has a clear idea about what he needs for his community. Or think about Don Isaac Barbanel, who was the court Jew in Spain in 1492, who had to plead with the crown about before the beginning of the expulsion from Spain. And I think of the words of Don Isaac, who says, "It is no great honor when a Jew is asked to plead for the safety of his people." And then I come back to Judah, and here he's negotiating with the Pharaoh's representative, and he doesn't have anything to offer. He doesn't have food or wealth or riches. All he has is to offer himself up as a replacement for his brother Benjamin. And all he has to offer is not a just outcome, but one in which his father will be harmed less.
This is so interesting because even Yosef at the beginning of his story, where he was sold down to Egypt, he actually does have something to offer. He has an interpretation of dreams.
Yes.
He has a plan for what Egypt should look like, meaning even he has more to offer than Judah has here.
Absolutely.
That's really fascinating. Wow, that's really fascinating. I wonder if one of the reasons the rabbis are going to read this as a confrontation rather than as a pleading is because of how uncomfortable the pleading version is. It's pretty uncomfortable.
I mean, add the layer of, Yehuda knows at the end of the last Parsha, he's already lied to Joseph, right? He said, my brother's dead. Right. Actually at the very beginning of this Parsha, he's like, my brother is already dead. My father has already lost one of the two. He knows he's lying to this person.
Wow. He knows he's in a little bit deep. Well, so there's another moment in this Parsha also where there's a kind of face-to-face that's pretty uncomfortable, but this is a known face-to-face. They know that they are looking at each other as brothers, and that is where Joseph says to his brothers, Ani Yosef, I am Joseph, is my father still alive? And the response of his brothers are, they couldn't answer him, ki nivhalu mipanav. They were scared of him, meaning they're standing there dumbfounded, maybe because they're worried about what he has in store for them, maybe because he holds up a mirror for them. But this is not a moment where they can find a plea or a confrontation. It's actually just a moment of, I would say, paralysis, really.
Yeah. One of the things I take from this turn in the encounter, and that's what it is, they're having this encounter and there's a turning moment of, I am Yosef, is that before he does this, Yosef knows this is about to be a conversation between two brothers, between two, let's call them Jews, although they didn't think of themselves that way. And it's time for this conversation to be a private conversation. Before he reveals himself, he tells his courtiers to leave the room. And like the actual Parsha is not clear about it, but to me, it's that he doesn't want the Egyptian court to know who he is, even though the Pharaoh is going to know almost immediately, as the text says. Is that what he's doing? Or is alternatively, because he knows that the Pharaoh is going to know soon, he's going to have to tell him why he's bringing his brothers down to Egypt. Is it more that he's like, now we're going to talk about amongst ourselves, and I'm going to tell you some horrible things about what you did to me. We're going to start really lobbing at each other as brothers, and that's a private conversation amongst Jews, not in front of the Gentiles kind of thing.
Okay, so what you're really you're getting us to like the no dirty laundry kind of, and we're going to talk amongst ourselves. I'm going to confront you here, and then we're going to have a united front when we go back out there, because to an extent, actually, Joseph recognizes that he has to answer to Pharaoh, meaning he's not the Pharaoh. He's also, one might say, a court Jew of sorts.
I mean, that's an interesting question. Right? Does Joseph know in this moment that the end of this conversation is he goes from being Pharaoh's right hand to being a court Jew of his own? And that's one of the outcomes of this conversation.
Yeah, or by the way, or a very public Jew. And then whatever he does to give special treatment to his family, as Egyptians are selling themselves to him during years of famine and selling their land while his family's living wonderfully, possibly sets us up for the beginning of the book of Exodus, where the Egyptians say, hey, what are these Israelites? Who invited these people here?
You know, you noted that they're dumbfounded, but like Joseph has the presence of mind to say, hey, you know, we better clear the room before we go here. That's a real interesting moment.
Right. He doesn't perform it. He doesn't perform it in front of other people, which is interesting. The rabbinic tradition takes these two moments, the moment of Judah in front of Joseph pleading, and the moment of the brothers kind of being dumbfounded, and tries to somewhat combine them. Of course, it's going to bring in another text, right? Two texts are not enough. We need a third. It's going to bring in another text from elsewhere in the Bible. In Psalms, in Tehillim, there's a verse that says, behold, the kings convened, they passed together. And the rabbis say, the kings convening are Yehuda and Yosef. Because, you know, think about it. They are the leaders of sorts of the Jewish people. They become the symbolic leaders. Right now, Joseph is the leader. Judah becomes symbolic of kingship. It actually passed is the English translation, but the Hebrew is avru. And the word avru, the rabbis say, no, avru is not, they just passed. There was evra, there was anger between the two of them. They actually were very angry at each other. And I love the idea of not saying this is actually a different read of what's going on, but saying this is exactly what's going on. When a Jew is beseeching another Jew, and they're at odds with what's going to happen, that beseeching, tell me there's no anger behind that beseeching. And when we're angry at each other for not having the same take and not wanting to go in the same direction, is there not a level of beseeching? Like, why can't just vote the way I want you to vote? Just do the thing that I want you to do. I actually think that this resentment and anger, and pleading, they go together. They go together. I don't think it's like a fundamentally different read of what's going on here.
I experience this often because in my role, we are very much speaking on behalf of a collective Jewish community, but we're not speaking on behalf of the whole Jewish community. And there isn't a week that goes by where some part of the Jewish community here in Boston, whether they see themselves as part of this collective or not, is angry at what we're saying, angry at what we're doing, angry at what we're pursuing. And I wonder sometimes, is it anger or is it disappointment? And I think that disappointment sometimes goes both ways. People are disappointed that the, let's say, the collective establishment, legacy, institutional Jewish community isn't where they're at. And at the same time, we're disappointed that whoever these are not seeing the world and the challenges of the Jewish people in the way that we are. And so there's this back and forth between, right up to our time, where Jews are disappointed in each other for not coming to where we are on understanding the challenges in the civic space. And looking at this text and thinking about these two and the idea of them as kings, we, the Jewish people today, are the descendants of both of them. They're both our kings, and they're both at such deep odds. And I don't think it's clear if one is stepping back from history and actually just saying, if I'm an observer in that room, knowing all the facts of both their narratives, I don't know if I know which one is right. Yehuda sold his brother into exile, but he's trying to protect his family and feed his family. Yosef is manipulating his brothers after having been harmed by them. Neither one of them is a perfect angelic figure on which we model our identity. And yet,
by the way, could we just be honest with the fact that sometimes our level of desperation to get other people to agree with us is because we are worried that there might be some truth to what it is that they think.
Yeah.
I don't think it's always just, I think you're completely wrong. I think sometimes there's an element of, is there something there? Can I ask you just the further question?
Yeah, sure.
Because you're also, you represent an organization, but you also walk into shul, you also walk into synagogue, meaning do you ever have those conversations where there are people who are in your private space, who are among those people who are angry at what you did and what your organization did?
On a personal level, absolutely. And from talking to colleagues, I think many of my colleagues around the country who are in public civic space representing Jewish interests also are challenged by then having to deal with the disappointment in our personal Jewish space, whether it's, going to shul or participating in our personal Jewish life, that people are like, why did you do that? Why did you do that? But I'm also finding that very grounding. Like, I have friends with whom I deeply disagree about some of the issues we're navigating. And I think that in some sense goes back to the earlier comment of like, we're having our disagreement in private as friends, whether it's sitting next to each other in shul and talking about these issues or whatever. And then there's the public. It's like, they're not necessarily, at least I'm saying for my friends, calling me out in public for what we've said or done.
Wow.
And I think I learn from them about their critique because it's a loving critique in personal relationship.
Well, it's interesting because there are probably like at least 3 layers to this, meaning there's just the fact that Jews are disagreeing in public, not facing off with each other, but simply supporting different candidates, simply supporting different policies. This org is putting out this statement and this org is putting out the opposite statement, right? Those are parallel lanes. Those are not actually intersecting, right? Then there's the call out culture of people calling each other out in public. And then there's the private conversations that people have, right? So I think all 3 of these are beset with different kinds of challenges, right? And I would say I think the first 2 are probably the 2 that I think make Jewish advocacy the hardest. Meaning, okay, people are not going to like what you did when you go to synagogue. But the point is, how do you explain to a third party, no, we're the Jews who think this, and you should follow what we say. So I want to do one more piece of the Midrash. The Midrash actually then goes on and says that same verse in Tehillim, in Psalms, doesn't just describe 2 kings coming together. It actually describes third parties watching. Hema ra'u kein tamahu. They're watching and they were dumbfounded. Now, in the original, that's actually about the kings themselves. But that's not the way the rabbis are reading them. They're reading it as a third party, okay? Meaning third parties are watching and are dumbfounded. And remember, we just said we have another verse in Vayiggash that says that the brothers were dumbfounded when their brother told them who they are. So the Midrash connects it with dumbfounded and dumbfounded. And so the rabbis get creative and say, you know who's dumbfounded? As Yehuda and Yosef go at each other, Elu Hashvatim, it's the rest of the brothers, it's the tribes, right? Amru, they basically say, Melachim midainim elu im elu. These 2 juggernauts are fighting with each other. Anu ma'achpat lanu, what are we supposed to say here, right? Ya'e lemelech midayin imelech. The juggernauts are supposed to fight each other. We're not fighting. And when I see that, I say to myself, well, first of all, that's like a lot of Jews watching the organized Jewish community. This one has this statement, this one has that statement, and we're like, I can't. I'm not getting involved. Those are statement places. Let them do their statements. But if instead of looking at the tribes, you can also look at the onlookers as the third party outside of the Jewish community, who we have to explain why the heck you have so many different Jewish statements there. And they're looking and going, what? How do I make heads and tails of this? And how do I know that you're the person I should hitch my wagon to and not that other group?
Yeah, I appreciate pivoting it to like, what is the third party beyond the Jewish community? And, in your introduction, you talked about what happened in New York last month and the New York Jewish community. And for those who don't know me, my first job out of college was as David Dinkins. My title was literally Deputy Director of Jewish Community Affairs. Bill de Blasio and I shared an office literally in the basement dungeon of City Hall. And more recently, I've spent time with him backstage at AIPAC conferences. So suffice to say, I have a lot to say about the history of New York having liberal and progressive mayors who were also deeply Zionist. I have a lot to say about this moment. And as a JCRC director, I believe fundamentally part of our space that we hold as civic actors is to respect and lift up the voice of the local community in dealing with local civic issues. So like my attitude about whether it's what do Jews in France need their American brothers and sisters to be saying when they're in trouble? What do New York Jews need to hear and say from other Jews around the country? And I'm like, that gets complicated when, say, New York Jews are not of one mind, which they obviously aren't. But at least for us structurally, I'm like, I don't say anything other than to lift up what the JCRC of New York says. However, in this case, we see these dynamics play out around the country. We just went through something here over the last year where we had a state commission on combating antisemitism. I served as a commissioner, and we just 2 weeks ago approved our final report, which is a roadmap for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to tackle antisemitism in K through 12 and higher ed and a whole bunch of other spaces. And we're really proud of it.
Wow.
But over the last year, Jews in Massachusetts very publicly litigated in the State House who speaks for the Jews. And we had anti-Zionist groups in the Jewish community that were going to legislators, going to members of the commission saying they, the Jews on the commission,
that's you,
me, representatives of AJC, of ADL, of a federation in the Berkshires, they don't speak for us. And sometimes there was like the language of, we want to talk about what Israel's doing in Gaza, and I won't use the language that was used. But what it was really about was Jews here were litigating who speaks for the Jews. And we were litigating it in public. Those of us who were on the inside, at the table, on the commission, and those of us, and I'm using us intentionally, who felt not at the table. And what we saw was a whole bunch of people beyond the Jewish community, the people who are in law enforcement, in education, in other spaces, who were suddenly like, what is this internal fracture that's in the Jewish community that they are so at each other's throats, and some of them are so determined to tear each other down?
So how do you explain that? Meaning, what's your role because you're describing, you're the legacy org. You're the mainstream Jewish politics still. Even if there's fractures, you're still the if we're talking statistics, you're still the
Yeah.
So how do you explain that? What's your...
Well, I think it's...
What role do you take there?
I think it's putting forward and being clear that we, whoever the we is, and in the case of us, for a JCRC, for a legacy collective, that we're the largest collective voice in our Jewish community, but we don't pretend to speak to everyone, for everyone. We don't pretend to speak for the anti-Zionist Jews, and we acknowledge they exist. We don't pretend to speak for unanimity within the Jewish community. There is no such thing as unanimity. But we can offer ourselves as, this is who we are. This is the stance we're taking in this moment. And also, here's the diversity of our community. And let's talk about how to navigate.
Here's the diversity of even what you're representing.
I would say of what we're representing and who we're not representing. We have an obligation.
Meaning you're clear that there is diversity within your tent, and there are other voices or another voice outside of your tent.
And by the way, I think also that we're still obligated to them. And I think that's a thing that we have a tricky thing. I think a lot of public voices on behalf of the Jewish community have a hard time conveying. That is, even when we are being criticized, to go back to the sort of language of disappointment that is coming our way, or the anger that's coming our way, even when there are parts of the Jewish community who are saying, they don't speak for me, I still have to sit in the space of, I am obligated to you as a Jew, whether you are the anti-Zionist member or the non-Zionist member of my synagogue. We sit in space together. We daven together. We have lunch together. I'm obligated to you in some way. I'm obligated to you, member of my Boston community who's anti-Zionist.
But here's a hard one. Is that because they're Jewish, or is that because you still share institutions? And I think this is a question, like, it's really a question that I have for people to think about, is what happens somewhere down the line? All still Jewish, but what if we don't share institutions in the same way and we stop coming across each other in that way? Will that sense of responsibility still obtain? And I think that's something that a lot of people are thinking about and trying to figure out, right? Like, or even trying to avoid, meaning they don't want it to become, two ships in the night.
Yeah.
But it may not be possible to have anything else ultimately. But I don't know. Meaning it may just go the way of Jewish sectarianism that has happened many, many, many times over Jewish history.
Yeah,
I'm not saying you have to say anything about that.
I don't know that there's a simple answer to that. I think the history of the Jewish people is one of, like, we debate our very, very deeply held differences about a vision for the Jewish people. And at the end of the day, some fade off into the horizon, and others become the forerunners to who we are. I mean, to go back to Yochanan ben Zakkai, but there was an alternative. Yeah. The alternative was Masada.
Right.
You can't tell me in 73 AD or CE, however, sorry, you can't tell me sitting there in that moment that everybody knew for certain that Yochanan ben Zakkai was right and the zealots were wrong.
Yeah.
And I think that's the dilemma for us, is like, we can only put forward our own clarity of vision for the future of the Jewish people and hope that history will judge us well.
Amen, my friend. I don't think I could say that better. I think the one way I would just pull it back to our Yehuda and Yosef is that I do wonder how much what Yehuda had to say changed what Yosef decided to say. And there's no way for us to know the answer to that. And so the Jew versus Jew, I don't know. The third parties certainly can use it. The third parties can scratch their head about it. But one of the things that's interesting about what you're saying is you try to do your job with a degree of humility and responsibility and transparency. And I would say, I would hope that not just the third party onlookers, but that Jews who are opposed to what you have to say appreciate that. And if they don't, they should. And I think, do you want to say any one last word?
Yeah, I would just, to what you just said, I'm reminded, I think there's something about how Yehuda approaches this, that in the text, he uses the word father 14 times. And there's an element of, he's speaking to Yosef, even if he doesn't know Yosef is his brother. Like, it could be everybody has a father, even the Pharaoh's aide. He's trying to reach across whatever differences in that space to speak to this person as a member of a person who understands family. And Yosef responds by like, oh God, he actually loves our shared father. And there's something in the use of language, intentionally and unintentionally, that they find commonality.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. And thanks for listening to our show, everyone. Special thanks to my chavruta, Jeremy Burton.